Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, November 16th, day 772 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Hi, Lazar. Did you have a nice Shabbat?
I had a lovely Shabbat up at Kibbutz Tirat Tzvi on the Jordanian border. It's wonderful.
Oh, how fun is that? And it was raining up there?
It was gorgeous. Rain, sun, winter, absolutely beautiful.
Amazing. Great time of year here in Israel. The United Nations Security Council is set to vote tomorrow on a resolution endorsing U.S. President Donald Trump's 20-point peace plan. The plan includes an international stabilization force as well as a pathway to a Palestinian state. So Lazar will update us on the resolution and Israeli responses so far. Saudi Arabia's crown prince is visiting Washington, D.C. this week, and Trump is toying with the idea of a massive fighter jet sale. So how could this affect the Middle East and Israel specifically? And finally, Lebanon's president said the country will file a complaint to the UN Security Council alleging that Israel is building a wall in southern Lebanon. So we'll hear all about this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Last week, the U.S. officially launched negotiations within the 15-member United Nations Security Council on a draft resolution which would follow up on Israel and Hamas's October 9th ceasefire-hostage agreement. So the Security Council is set to vote on the resolution tomorrow, and among other things, it would deliver Gaza to an International Stabilization Force and an apolitical Palestinian administration, which is overseen by a Trump-chaired Board of Peace. It also envisions a potential pathway to a Palestinian state. So, Lazar, you and I spoke with leading urban warfare expert John Spencer for this past Friday's Friday Focus. And those of you who missed it, please check it out. You can still listen to the full episode, of course. But, Lazar, before we dive in, explain a little bit about this idea of using the International Stabilization Force in Gaza.
So a central part of this Trump plan is a solution for who makes sure that Gaza doesn't present a threat. Obviously, Hamas doesn't present a threat to Israel in the future. And the idea is an international force, a peacekeeping force, under the name International Stabilization Force, ISF. Now, the big questions around that force are, I think, twofold. One is who is in this force, and number two, what is the force going to do? So what's its mandate? The question of who is in this force is becoming more and more of a problem. So not many countries really are rushing toward this thing. You've heard Azerbaijan, Indonesia as kind of the most likely right now. The Saudis and Emiratis seem like they're not going to contribute to this. And Turkey seems quite interested in being part of this force. Of course, having Turkish troops right on Israel's southern border and really having a influential part of what happens in the future of the Gaza Strip is obviously not something that Israel wants. Turkey is a backer of Hamas, openly calls them a resistance organization, not a terrorist organization. They host leaders and is really becoming one of Israel's main adversaries in the region after Iran, and might overtake Iran in that role someday. So that is a big question. Now, a lot of the countries say we have to know what the mandate is before we commit to troops or not. No countries want to have their own forces fighting against Hamas to protect Israel. That's only something Israel would do.
Except for Indonesia, right? We heard a report.
They're not going to fight with Hamas. They're not going to fight against Hamas.
They're not going. Okay.
No.
So what do you make of these reports that they've already begun training 20,000 Indonesians to be sent to the Gaza Strip? What are they meant to do then?
That's the question, right? So if it's not a peace enforcement force, it's a peacekeeping force. So it means they don't initiate combat against Hamas. They ride around, they give reports, they establish a presence, they could check people moving back and forth. It's a peacekeeping mission, which is not all that helpful if Hamas is determined to rearm and to threaten Israel in the future. So that's one. So then the question is the mandate. Israel obviously wants them to have an aggressive mandate where they have to root out Hamas, and if there's any sort of threat against Israel, then they go in and they take care of that militarily. As I said, countries don't want to do that. So that's where we are in this terms of the International Stabilization Force. There's also a problem that I've pointed out is that it limits Israel's freedom of action. So Israel wants these serious countries like the Saudis and Emiratis there, but that means their troops will be there. And if they get in the way of Israeli operations, then they could get hurt or killed. And that becomes, first of all, a serious consideration for Israel as it plans its operations. And then if anything happens, it becomes a serious diplomatic issue. So that is where things stand on this ISF, which is becoming more and more of a problem the more time goes by.
Okay, so the resolution tomorrow, the ISF is part of the resolution, but not the entirety. So what is meant to be voted on?
So it'll be back in the 20-point plan. There's several elements, obviously. Of course, a big one is the specific mandate of the ISF and what happens next in the Gaza Strip. Now, for Israel politically, the part about creating a pathway for a credible pathway for a Palestinian state is one I think that is very important to many of the backers of this plan. Whereas for Israel, that's, it's obviously something that this coalition and many opposition parties are against. So what you're going to have is even though Israel is not voting on this, they've never been in the Security Council, but they are backing this UN resolution. So it has a lot of weight in law that openly talks about moving toward a Palestinian state. It doesn't say it's going to establish one. It's way down the line, but that is something I'm sure that will upset parties like Bezalel Smotrich's and Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, and will give them another reason to think about leaving this government ahead of the end of its term in another year.
Right. On Friday, there was a joint statement that was sent out in coordination with the U.S. and in which multiple countries were working toward an end to the conflict, voiced backing for the resolution. And I just want to point out some of the countries. It was supported by Qatar, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Jordan, and Turkey. So some of these are more or less friendly to Israel. But the one I want to highlight in this group of countries is Saudi Arabia. And the idea of a pathway to peace, not, necessarily working on a Palestinian state, but the idea of a pathway to peace has been one of these sticking points in terms of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accord. So do you think that this language is in this resolution with that in mind?
Oh, certainly countries like Saudi Arabia, but there's this goal by the U.S. and by Israel to get Saudi Arabia to agree to normalization. And this is all seen as this broader package that everyone gives and receives something. And the Saudis, not that they are big lovers of the idea of a Palestinian state, and it doesn't really matter to the rulers in Saudi Arabia that much, but it's something they feel like they have to back right now, especially if they're going to consider deeper cooperation with Israel. So that's definitely in it for them, and not only for them, for other states that are worried about pushback from their publics about, not backing the Palestinians enough or being too conciliatory toward Israel. This language of a Palestinian state is a must for them.
Right. And what's interesting to me, of course, is how U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, is selling this as well. And basically, he's saying that failure to endorse this resolution is basically support for Hamas and for war. What do you think about this kind of branding?
So first of all, Mike Waltz is absolutely a friend of Israel. There's no question. So the fact that he's there at the UN is a good thing for Israel. Listen, this has to be sold to multiple parties, often with conflicting interests. So again, the fact that you have Turkey and Qatar agreeing to this and you need Israel to agree to this means different people have to receive different things or be able to interpret it in a way that is favorable to them. Listen, this is not the only way to prevent war in the Gaza Strip. And just because it prevents war, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing for Israel right now, right? Obviously, it depends under what conditions war is prevented. Israel could have prevented war by not going to war after October 7th and ensuring that Hamas remains in power. There are worrying indications, the more time goes by, that Hamas is playing for time and they're able to deepen their hold on the parts of Gaza that they control, which is the vast majority of the population. And the will to really see Hamas disarmed and out of power is starting to weaken. And it's only Israel that's really, really dedicated to this, but they don't have the legitimacy to go back to war. But Waltz is making the argument that there are absolutely very clear clauses about Hamas disarming, and this is the way to do it. And the U.S. has rhetorically been very consistent about that it is committed to it and that it is going to happen. So, while there are these very worrying signs, it depends how much you trust. Really, it's going to be the Trump administration's resolve to see this thing through.
And of course, winter is here, as we noted at the beginning of the program, and all eyes are on what is happening in the tent city in the Mawasi area, which is close to the sea. And of course, all eyes are on Israel, pointing to Israel. What is Israel going to do? What are Israel's obligations that they are, quote unquote, not fulfilling? So, Lazar, you have a bit of an update on this, no?
Yeah, pretty hot update. First of all, I want to point out winter is not officially here. We have more than a month till the winter solstice, excuse me. But in terms of the way Israel thinks about winter, we have our first serious rainstorm, real beautiful winter weather. So you are correct. But on a more serious note, you have 2 million Gazans, most of whom are living in all sorts of temporary shelters, including a lot of tents. There was a lot of pictures from the weekend of what that looks like. Now, the Gaza Strip is not the coldest place, in around here. It's not elevated, but it can be quite miserable if you're in the sand. The weather got pretty cold, and of course, that rain, you don't want to be wet, especially if you have little kids and nutrition isn't great. So it's certainly a serious thing. Now, I spoke to COGAT, which is the IDF body responsible for this humanitarian effort. And they were quite clear that they are fully committed, I'm quoting them, to the obligation to facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid trucks. They said hundreds of trucks have gone in carrying equipment and food that is specifically part of this plan to prepare for the winter. They said this isn't taking anyone by surprise. They've been preparing over the last few months with the international aid agencies to get Gaza ready for the winter. So that's food, water, fuel, gas, medicine, equipment, tents, shelter supplies have all been going in. 90,000 tents and tarps have gone in recent weeks as well. So they have a specific response ready for the winter. Of course, it's not going to keep every tent dry, and it's not going to keep everyone out of danger. But Israel is quite adamant that it is aware of this challenge, and it is working with the UN, with international organizations, donor countries, and with the private sector to make sure everything that needs to go in is going in. Well, of course, we'll have to judge the result as the winter continues.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. U.S. President Donald Trump on Friday said that he was considering agreeing to a deal to supply Saudi Arabia with F-35 stealth fighter jets, which are made by Lockheed Martin. Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One, they want to buy a lot of jets. I'm looking into that. They've asked me to look at it. They want to buy a lot of 35s, but they want to buy actually more than that, fighter jets. So, Lazar, let's take a bit of a zoom out, an aerial view, if you will, and talk about how a bulked up Saudi Air Force may affect the Middle East.
So probably not that much in practice. Chances are the Saudis aren't going to use it for any major adventures. After their effort to back forces in Yemen, actually to be quite involved in combat there, they've shown a decidedly cautious approach in terms of using their military. They're not striking the Houthis. They're dealing with the Iranian threat through dialogue and diplomacy. So the chances are they're not going to go on any adventures there. There is a concern what happens if the regime in Saudi Arabia falls, which is always a possibility for these type of autocratic governments. It's not a very high possibility, but it could happen. And then there's a concern there. For the U.S., actually, the concern is access for China to this advanced U.S. technology. There is certainly the potential for war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan or over access to shipping lanes and other things in the Far East. And the F-35s would be a central part of that. I will remind our listeners that Israel, in 2020, as part of the Abraham Accords, the UAE was supposed to get the F-35. Israel was fine with that. Didn't see a threat from the UAE, but the U.S. has not delivered it because so much of the Emirati computer government computer frameworks are Chinese, and that really concerns them in terms of espionage. So the same problem with the Saudis exists. So that's the major U.S. concern. In a 2008 U.S. law, America is required to maintain Israel's qualitative military edge, which is generally interpreted as technological. So Israel's the only Middle Eastern country with the F-35s. They've been using it more than anybody else. I'm sure the U.S. is learning a lot about this system from Israel. So it has to maintain an edge there. So the question is, how will selling it to the Saudis meet or comply with that U.S. law? But in principle, if Israel didn't have a problem with the UAE, it shouldn't really have that much of a problem with the Saudis having it. Of course, Saudi Arabia is much, much closer, so there might be an arrangement where Saudis can't put them on Western Saudi bases, so they'll be far away from Israel. But the main concern is what happens if that falls into other people's hands rather than a direct Saudi attack on Israel, which would just be foolhardy, and they would lose that in every imaginable scenario.
Really interesting. Thanks for that, Lazar. Now, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, also known as UNIFIL, said on Friday that the Israeli army has built walls on the Lebanese side of the UN demarcated blue line. This is the de facto border. There is no actual border. And when asked by AFP news agency about this, the Israeli military said the wall does not cross the blue line. So first of all, let's remind listeners, what is the blue line?
Yep. So Israel does not have an agreed upon land border with Lebanon. Lebanon doesn't have an agreed upon land border with anybody. But after the pullout in 2000 from southern Lebanon, the UN came and they said that Israel had totally pulled out, and they marked this thing called the blue line, which is the withdrawal line. And that is what has determined where Israel is legally allowed to operate freely and when it's considered, let's say, an invasion, because of course there's Israeli troops in Lebanon right now. It's been something that Hezbollah in the past had tried to protect, and now the Lebanese state is trying to be more vocal about that. Israel has started building a wall on the northern border before October 7th, but certainly since then it has really ramped up its efforts to create a physical barrier there. There's an accusation by the Lebanese that this is going, and by UNIFIL, that one section is going into Lebanese territory. Israel says it's not. I don't think that's going to be the reason for any sort of descent into an escalation. There's other reasons for escalation, which Israel is choosing. But this is something that, Israel and UNIFIL and the Lebanese state will have to work out. Of course, if there was a clearly marked border, which the U.S. is pushing for and that Israel wants as well, this would be less likely to happen.
Okay, so where is the IDF right now? Did you mention that to our listeners, these 5 points?
Yeah, so Israel pulled out of most of Lebanon after the war last year. There's still 5 strategic hilltops that separate between Israeli communities on the Israeli side of the border and the rest of Lebanon. So there's 5 points. Israel says it's going to pull out at some point, but it needs to see that the security in southern Lebanon is taken care of, that Hezbollah has been disarmed there, that the Lebanese army is properly deployed and can guarantee the safety of Israel's residents, almost all of whom were evacuated after October 7th, and are certainly aware of the threat that Hezbollah poses and how quickly it would take invading forces to reach their homes.
So my final question, just to draw together our beginning and end of the program, is how incredibly important is the United Nations Security Council in all of this? Meaning we have a complaint from Lebanon and we have this resolution. Tell us, how much weight does it actually have in terms of what's going to happen in Israel?
So less weight than UN people that are dedicated to that see UN as the proper arbiter of what happens in disputes would like to see. It's a tool. So every country uses it as a tool to advance their own interests.